serpent guards the temple, and it has human eyes. Welcome to local legends. Today, the Naga. The stone steps descend into darkness, each one worn smooth by centuries of barefoot pilgrims. Water seeps through cracks in the ancient masonry, pooling in depressions that hold the reflected light of oil lamps like amber gems. The air is thick with moisture and the smell of incense, sandalwood, jasmine, something older and earthier beneath. Your hand traces the wall for balance, and the stone is cool and damp, carved with reliefs so weathered they seem to move in the flickering light. Figures twist along the corridor, bodies that are human from the waist up, serpentine below. Hoods flare from their heads. Their eyes, even in stone, even after 1,000 monsoons, seem to follow your descent. At the bottom, the passage opens into a chamber. The ceiling disappears into shadow. A spring wells up from the rock floor, dark water that never stills, never freezes. Fed by channels that reach down into the earth, farther than any excavation has ever followed. Around the spring's edge, offerings, flowers already browning in the humidity, coins blackened with age, small clay lamps with wicks still burning, and beyond the spring, carved from the living rock of the wall itself, a figure coiled, massive, the body of a king cobra. Scales rendered in such detail, you can see where each overlaps the next. The hood spread wide as a war shield, but the face is human. The eyes are open, and in certain light, in the moment before your own lamp gutters in a draught, you cannot feel they seem wet, aware, patient. This is not the lair, this is a threshold, a boundary between the world of sunlight and dust, and the world below, the realm of water and treasure and knowledge that predates the written word. And the being that guards this boundary is neither demon nor beast, but something older than both those categories. Protector, keeper, teacher, destroyer, when the sacred order is violated. In Sanskrit, the name is pronounced with a soft aspiration at the beginning, a sound like breath over water, Naga. The land that gave form to the Naga stretches across a vast geographical and cultural expanse, from the river valleys of northern India to the jungle temples of Cambodia, from the high plateaus of Tibet to the rice terraces of Bali. But the deepest roots of Naga mythology sink into the soil of the Indian subcontinent, where the Indus Valley civilization was already ancient. When the Vedic peoples arrived from the northwest, sometime in the second millennium before the Common Era, the collision and synthesis of these cultures, indigenous Dravidian and incoming Indo-Aryan, produced a cosmology of extraordinary complexity, and within that cosmology, the Nagas occupied a place of profound importance. The people who first gave literary form to Naga beliefs were the composers and compilers of the Hindu epics and Puranas, texts that reached their final forms between roughly 400 BCE and 400 CE. Though they drew on oral traditions far older. These were agrarian societies, dependent on the rhythms of the monsoon, on the fertility of river valleys, on the springs and wells that meant the difference between abundance and famine. Water was not merely a resource, it was a spiritual substance, the medium through which the divine manifested in the physical world, and the creatures most intimately associated with water serpents became symbols of that life-giving, life-sustaining power. But the Naga tradition was never confined to Hinduism alone. As Buddhism spread from its birthplace in the Gangetic Plain outward across Asia in the centuries, following the Buddha's death around 400 BCE, it carried with it a transformed but still central role for the Nagas. In Buddhist cosmology, Nagas were recognized as sentient beings capable of enlightenment, guardians of the Buddha's teachings, and protectors of those who sought liberation. When Buddhism traveled along the trade routes into Southeast Asia, into what are now Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, it encountered indigenous serpent cults and water spirit beliefs that had existed for millennia. The synthesis was seamless. The great temple complexes of Angkor in Cambodia, built between the 9th and 13th centuries CE, are ringed with stone Naga balustrades, the serpent bodies forming bridges between the human realm and the divine. In Thailand, the Naga became Naga Prok, a multi-headed serpent whose image adorns temple roofs, and whose mythology is woven into the origin stories of cities and kingdoms. The worldview that sustained these beliefs was one in which the visible world rested upon and was interpenetrated by invisible realms of great power and danger. Beneath the surface of the earth, in the waters of rivers and oceans, in the hollow places inside mountains, dwelt beings whose lifespans made human generations seem like the flicker of mayflies. These beings possessed knowledge, treasures, and powers that humans could access only through proper ritual, respectful approach, and spiritual preparation. To violate their spaces without permission was to court catastrophe. In Hindu tradition, it is described in texts like the Mahabharata and the Puranas as a place of unimaginable. The Bhagavata Purana, composed in Sanskrit sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries CE, describes Patala as having cities built of gold and jewels, illuminated not by sun or moon, but by the radiant gems set into the hoods of the Naga kings themselves. There is no poverty there, no disease, no aging as humans understand it. The Nagas possess all the pleasures of the senses in abundance, but they are also guardians of the treasures of the earth, of sacred knowledge, of the waters that rise as springs and rivers, to nourish the world above. The Nagas are not uniform. They are a race, a people, with hierarchies and royal lines. The great Naga kings whose names appear repeatedly in Sanskrit and Pali texts include Shesha, also called Ananta, the thousand-headed serpent upon whose coils the god Vishnu reclines in the cosmic ocean; Vasuki, the serpent used as a rope in the churning of the ocean of milk to produce the nectar of immortality; and Takshaka, a powerful and dangerous Naga king, who appears in the Mahabharata as both antagonist and tragic figure, driven by vengeance after his kingdom is burned by the warrior Arjuna. In Buddhist texts, the most beloved Naga figure is Mokalinda. The story is told in the Pali Canon, the earliest collection of Buddhist scriptures compiled in the centuries immediately following the Buddha's death. According to the account, the Buddha, newly awakened, sat in meditation beneath a tree for 7 days. On the 7th day, a great storm arose, out of season, violent, threatening. Mokalinda, the Naga king who dwelt in a lake nearby, emerged from the water, coiled his body 7 times around the seated Buddha to provide warmth and stability, and spread his great hood above the Buddha's head to shelter him from the rain. When the storm passed, Mokalinda assumed human form and paid homage. The Buddha blessed him, and Mokalinda became one of the protectors of the Dharma, the Buddhist teaching. This story is represented in countless sculptures and paintings across South and Southeast Asia, always recognizable. The Buddha seated in meditation, the cobra's hood rising behind and above him like a halo of scales. The physical form of the Naga is fluid context, dependent, and deeply symbolic. In their native shape, they appear as immense serpents, most commonly cobras, with hoods that can spread to terrifying width. The number of heads varies according to rank and power. A common Naga might have a single head. A Naga prince might have 3, 5, or 7. The great Naga kings are depicted with 9, or even 1,000, heads arrayed in a fan that forms a canopy. The scales are often described in texts as jewel, like each one a different color, flashing in the darkness of the underworld with its own light. The eyes are large and unblinking, capable of seeing in absolute darkness, capable of piercing illusion. In some descriptions, the Naga's breath is poisonous. In others, it is fragrant as sandalwood, or carries the scent of water after rain. But the defining characteristic of the Naga is the ability to assume human form. This is not shape-shifting as it appears in many other mythologies. A wolf that becomes a man, a swan that becomes a maiden. The Naga transformation is an expression of their essential nature as beings who exist between categories. When a Naga takes human form, they do not merely disguise themselves. They manifest a different aspect of their being. The human form is as real as the serpent form, and even in human shape, certain signs often remain. The eyes are slightly too large, or have a faint vertical pupil if you look closely. The gait is sinuous, smoother than a human's should be. They are drawn to water, uncomfortable in dry heat. They wear jewels, always jewels. And in the oldest stories, these jewels are not ornaments, but pieces of the Naga's own body. Scales transformed, still carrying a fragment of the serpent's power. Regional variations in Naga appearance are significant. In South Indian tradition, particularly in Tamil and Kerala mythology, Nagas are sometimes depicted as having the upper body of a human and the lower body of a serpent from the waist down, similar to the Greek image of the Lamia. These are called Naga Kanya, when female, Naga Kumar when male. In Tibetan Buddhist iconography, Nagas, called Klu in Tibetan, are more often depicted as fully serpentine, dwelling in lakes and rivers, and are associated with specific weather phenomena. They are said to cause rain, hail, and lightning when displeased, and to bring gentle, nourishing rains when properly honored. In Thai tradition, the Naga's body is elongated, almost dragon-like, with elaborate cresting along the spine, and is portrayed in constant motion, coiling around temple pillars, forming staircase balustrades, rearing up from the eaves of roofs with open mouths and extended tongues. The abilities attributed to Nagas extend far beyond mere physical transformation. They are masters of illusion, capable of creating entire phantom palaces, of making the night seem like day, of causing travelers to lose their way or find paths where none existed before. They control water in all its forms: rain, rivers, wells, the moisture in the air. A Naga's blessing can bring fertility to fields and wombs. A Naga's curse can bring drought, flood, or epidemic. They possess knowledge of medicine and poison, which in traditional Indian thought are not opposites, but two aspects of the same science. The Atharva Veda, one of the four Vedas, and the one most concerned with practical magic and healing, contains numerous hymns for protection against serpent venom, and these hymns invoke the Nagas by name, addressing them as beings who can both cause and cure. In terms of weaknesses, the law is specific. Nagas are vulnerable to the attack of the Garuda, the great eagle, like mount of the god Vishnu. The enmity between Naga and Garuda is ancient, rooted in a mythological event described in the Mahabharata, a wager between two divine mothers, Kadru, mother of serpents, and Vinata, mother of birds, that resulted in Vinata being enslaved by Kadru. Vinata's son Garuda, to free his mother, had to steal the nectar of immortality from the gods themselves. He succeeded, but the Nagas, attempting to drink the nectar, were interrupted, and only a few drops touched the ground. They licked the grass where the nectar had fallen, and their tongues were split, which is why serpents have forked tongues. The Garuda, meanwhile, became the eternal enemy of the serpent race. This mythological antagonism is represented in countless artworks, with Garuda depicted grasping serpents in his talons, tearing them apart, triumphant. Certain plants and mantras are said to offer protection against malevolent Nagas. The Sanskrit texts prescribe offerings of milk, flowers, particularly jasmine and lotus, and sandalwood paste as ways to appease Nagas and avert their wrath. Structures called Naga Kal, serpent stones, are found throughout South India, erected at the boundaries of villages, near wells, and under sacred trees. These are both memorials and protective shrines, places where the Nagas are honored and asked to guard the community rather than harm it. The transformation of a Naga from serpent to human form, or the origin of the Naga race itself, is explained differently in different textual traditions. In the Mahabharata, the Nagas are the offspring of Kadru, one of the daughters of the cosmic progenitor Daksha. Kadru, through a blessing, or in some versions, a curse, gave birth to 1,000 serpents, the ancestors of all the Naga race. They are thus divine by lineage, cousins to gods and demons both. Part of the intricate genealogy, their nature is neither wholly good nor wholly evil like humans. They are capable of righteousness or wickedness, of wisdom or folly. But unlike humans, they possess power that makes their choices consequential on a cosmic scale. In Buddhist tradition, the Nagas are one of the 8 classes of non-human beings who attended the Buddha's teachings. They are categorized as devas, divine beings in some texts, as pretas, hungry ghosts in others, depending on their karma and current spiritual state. A Naga who has accumulated merit through countless lifetimes may be reborn as a human and achieve enlightenment. A human who lives with cruelty and greed may be reborn as a Naga, possessing great power, but trapped in a form that prevents certain spiritual practices. The Buddha himself, in a previous life, was said to have been born as a Naga king, demonstrating compassion and wisdom even in that serpentine form. The story of the Naga princess who married a human king appears in various forms across South and Southeast Asian literature. But one of the most influential versions comes from the Khmer Foundation myth of Cambodia. According to the legend, recorded in Chinese chronicles from as early as the 3rd century CE and elaborated in later Khmer inscriptions, a Brahmin prince named Kaundinya arrived by ship at the coast of what is now Cambodia. There he encountered Soma, a Naga princess, daughter of the Naga king who ruled the watery realm beneath the land. Soma rowed out in a boat to meet the foreign prince. Kaundinya fired an arrow from a magical bow, and Soma, awed by his power, agreed to marry him. As her dowry, Soma's father drank the water that covered the land, revealing the fertile earth beneath, and giving the new kingdom to the couple. From this union of foreign prince and Naga princess, the Khmer people claimed descent. The legitimacy of the Khmer kings was thus bound to their Naga ancestry. They were not conquerors of the land, but were born from it. Through the Naga line, similar marriage stories appear in Thai, Lao, and Vietnamese origin myths. In the Vietnamese tradition, the Hung kings, legendary founders of the Vietnamese nation, were said to be descended from Lac Long Quan, a dragon lord Aa being closely related to the Naga, and Au Ko, a mountain fairy. Their children were the 100 original Vietnamese families. The dragon, serpent lineage is thus central to Vietnamese ethnic identity, and the Naga, or dragon, remains a potent symbol of national continuity. These marriage tales encode something more complex than simple romance. They represent the integration of indigenous beliefs, the Naga as a symbol of the land, the water, the chthonic powers with incoming cultural influences, the Brahmin, the foreign prince, the new religious or political order. The Naga princess, by marrying the human king, legitimizes his rule, binds him to the land, makes him answerable to the old powers. The children of such unions are not purely human. They carry Naga blood, Naga knowledge, Naga responsibility. They are mediators, living bridges between worlds. The taboos surrounding Nagas are precise and regionally specific. In rural South India, cutting down a tree that is known to be inhabited by a Naga, typically an old banyan or peepal tree, is considered an invitation to disaster. The Naga may curse the offender with skin diseases, infertility, or madness. If such a tree must be cut for unavoidable reasons, elaborate rituals of apology and compensation are performed, including the erection of a Naga stone and ongoing offerings. In Sri Lanka, farmers traditionally leave a portion of each field uncultivated and dedicated to the Nagas, a small wild corner where snakes can live undisturbed, ensuring that the harvest from the rest of the field will be blessed. In Buddhist monastic practice, monks are instructed to be cautious around large bodies of water and to avoid urinating or defecating into rivers and lakes, not merely for hygiene, but because these are the abodes of Nagas, and to pollute their homes is to invite their anger. The Vinaya, the code of monastic discipline, includes specific rules about this. Stories are told of monks who, through disrespect or ignorance, offended Nagas and brought illness or misfortune upon their entire monastery, cured only when the abbot made formal apologies and offerings at the water's edge. In the high valleys of Nepal and Bhutan, where Buddhism and older animist traditions interweave, certain lakes are known as Naga lakes, and local communities maintain prohibitions against fishing in them, throwing stones into them, or even speaking loudly on their shores. These are not superstitions in the dismissive sense. They are ecological practices encoded in spiritual language, ways of maintaining the health of fragile high-altitude ecosystems by limiting human interference. The Naga, in this context, is both a religious figure and an environmental ethic. The story of the Naga and the Garuda, beyond its mythological drama, functions as a teaching about balance. The Nagas represent the underworld, water, fertility, the inward, turning wisdom of meditation and dream. The Garuda represents the sky, fire, solar power, the outward expansion of action and heroism. They are not merely enemies but necessary opposites, and the cosmos requires both. When Nagas are depicted in temple architecture alongside Garudas, the serpent on one side of a doorway, the eagle on the other, the message is not that one is good and the other evil, but that both forces must be acknowledged, honored, and passed between as one enters the sacred space. The encounter between Naga mythology and Western thought began in earnest with the arrival of European colonial powers in South and Southeast Asia, starting in the 16th century with Portuguese, Dutch, and later British expansion. The worldview these colonizers brought with them had no conceptual category for beings like the Nagas. In the Christian cosmology that most Europeans carried, the serpent was the devil, the tempter, the embodiment of evil since the Garden of Eden, a creature that was both serpent and divine, that was worshipped and honored, that could be wise and benevolent, was theologically incomprehensible, or worse, demonic. Early missionary accounts from India and Southeast Asia reflect this confusion and hostility. The Jesuit priest Roberto de Nobili, who arrived in Madurai in South India in 1606, and spent decades attempting to convert high-caste Hindus by adopting many of their customs, nonetheless condemned the worship of Nagas as snake worship and idolatry. In his Tamil writings, he argued that the Christian God alone had power over nature and that the Nagas were either figments of imagination or, in his darker moods, manifestations of Satan designed to lead souls astray. His accounts, sent back to Rome and published in Jesuit journals, helped establish a European image of Hindu religion as a labyrinth of bizarre and diabolical superstitions. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as European control over the Indian subcontinent deepened, a different kind of interpretation emerged. The mythological allegorical reading. British scholars associated with the Asiatic Society of Bengal, founded in 1784 by Sir William Jones, began to study Sanskrit texts systematically. They translated the epics, the Puranas, the Vedas, but their interpretive framework was shaped by the rationalism of the Enlightenment and the comparative mythology that was becoming fashionable in European universities. The Nagas, in this reading, were not spiritual realities, but poetic symbolism. They represented ancient tribes of serpent worshippers, or they were allegories for rivers, because serpents are sinuous like water, or they encoded astronomical knowledge. The eclipses were caused by the Naga Rahu swallowing the sun or moon. This allegorical approach had the advantage of taking Hindu and Buddhist texts seriously as literature and philosophy, rather than dismissing them as mere devil worship. The Nagas became symbols to be decoded, relics of primitive thought to be catalogued, rather than living presences that real people encountered in their lives. The British folklorist George Cox, in his 1870 book, The Mythology of the Aryan Nations, argued that Naga myths were debased memories of ancient Aryan nature worship, serpents standing in for storm clouds or lightning. The German Indologist Hermann Oldenburg, in his 1894 study Die Religion des Veda, The Religion of the Veda, categorized Nagas as survivals from pre-Aryan Dravidian animism, incompletely assimilated into the higher Vedic religion. These interpretations, however well-intentioned, imposed European categories: primitive versus civilized, symbolic versus literal, superstition versus religion, onto traditions that recognized no such divisions. For a Tamil farmer in the 1870s, the Naga was not a symbol. It was a reality, no less real than the British tax collector, the monsoon, or the stone shrine at the edge of the field. The British colonial encounter with Naga mythology in Southeast Asia followed a similar pattern. When French scholars began to study the inscriptions and architecture of Angkor Wat in the 1860s and 1870s, the great temple complex having been rediscovered by Europeans after centuries of Khmer control and use, they were confronted with ubiquitous Naga imagery. The causeways leading to the temple gates are lined with stone balustrades carved as Naga bodies, held aloft by rows of gods and demons in the act of churning the cosmic ocean. French archaeologists like Fétien Aimonia, who surveyed Cambodian temples in the 1880s and published his findings in Le Cambodge 1900 to 1904, described these carvings in aesthetic and historical terms, but struggled to convey their religious meaning. The Naga became, in French writing, a motif, a decorative element, rather than a guardian, a threshold being, a manifestation of the divine. British accounts from Burma, Myanmar, and Thailand showed similar patterns. Sir James George Scott, a British colonial administrator, who wrote extensively about Burmese culture under the pen name Shui Yoi, published The Burman, His Life and Notions in 1882. He described the Naga, called Naga in Burmese, as well as a feature of local superstition, dwelling in rivers and lakes, believed to cause storms and floods. Scott recorded several stories of villagers making offerings to Nagas before crossing rivers or undertaking journeys, charming examples of rustic credulity, rather than as coherent spiritual practices rooted in a cosmology as the most significant European figure in the study of Buddhism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was Twadeu Rhys Davids, founder of the Pali Text Society in 1881. Rhys Davids translated key Buddhist scriptures into English, making them accessible to Western scholars for the first time. His translations of the Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous lives, included numerous accounts involving Nagas. But Rhys Davids, a committed rationalist, struggled with how to present these beings to a European audience. In his introductions and footnotes, he often suggested that Nagas were mythologized versions of real serpents. Cobras were common in India after all, or that they represented Aboriginal tribes. He was reluctant to acknowledge that Buddhist monks and laypeople genuinely believed in Nagas as sentient spiritual beings. This reluctance reflected a deeper problem in the colonial encounter with Asian religions. The assumption that real religion was either monotheistic and transcendent, like Christianity, or philosophical and abstract, like the Buddhism that appealed to Western intellectuals. Beings like Nagas, which did not fit into either category, were treated as folk accretions, colorful, but ultimately peripheral to the true spiritual core. This was a profound misunderstanding. For most practitioners of Buddhism and Hinduism in Asia, the Nagas were not peripheral. They were woven into daily ritual, ethical teaching, cosmological understanding, and the landscape itself. One of the few Western scholars to grasp this more fully was Ananda Koamaraswamy, a Sri Lankan Tamil philosopher and art historian who worked primarily in the early 20th century. In his 1928 essay, The Nature of Buddhist Art, Koamaraswamy argued that the Naga, Garuda, Yaksha, and other non-human beings in Buddhist iconography were not mere decoration or mythology, but represented spiritual realities, modes of existence, levels of consciousness, forces within the psyche and cosmos that the practitioner must recognize and integrate. Koamaraswamy's work, grounded in both traditional Asian learning and modern Western philosophy, offered a bridge between worlds, though it remained largely unread by the colonial administrators and missionaries who were actually shaping policy and opinion on the ground. The contrast between indigenous and colonial interpretations can be seen starkly in accounts of specific events. In May 1902, in the Jaffna district of British Ceylon, Sri Lanka, a severe drought had lasted for months. Tamil and Sinhalese villagers organized a procession to a sacred lake, believed to be inhabited by a powerful Naga. They carried offerings of milk, flowers, and incense. They chanted mantras. The next day, rain fell. Not a deluge, but steady, nourishing rain that continued for 3 days. To the villagers, the connection was obvious. The Naga had been honored, and the Naga had responded. The British district officer, in his report filed in the Ceylon administrative records, noted the procession, noted the rain, and attributed the timing to coincidence. The villagers, he wrote, persist in their snake worship, despite all efforts at education. Neither account is complete. The villagers' belief does not rule out meteorological explanation. Traditional practitioners would say that the Naga is the pattern in the weather, the intelligence in the hydrological cycle, not separate from it but intrinsic to it. And the British officer's skepticism, while scientifically defensible in one sense, misses the social and psychological reality. The ritual brought the community together, focused intention, provided a narrative of agency and hope in the face of natural disaster. Whether or not a literal serpent being caused the rain, the belief in the Naga had material effects. The most detailed Western engagement with Naga traditions came from anthropologists in the 20th century. Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, working in Bali in the 1930s, documented the role of Naga imagery in Balinese temple rituals and water management systems. Their photographs and field notes, published in Balinese Character 9 1842, show Naga carvings flanking irrigation gates, linking religious practice directly to agricultural infrastructure. The Naga was not a symbol separate from the water. It was the way the community thought about, organized, and related to water as a living system. In Thailand, the British anthropologist H.G. Quaritch Wales conducted extensive studies in the 1930s and 1940s on the integration of Hindu-Buddhist cosmology with indigenous animism. His 1953 book, The Mountain of God, described how Naga beliefs had been incorporated into Thai royal ceremony. The king was seen as the earthly representative of Vishnu, and thus also as the master of the Naga, just as Vishnu in mythology reclines upon the serpent Shesha. But the Thai Naga was not merely subservient. It was a partner, a foundation. The king's legitimacy depended on the Naga's acceptance. Wales recorded that in the traditional Thai coronation ceremony, the king had to symbolically descend into water, representing the Naga realm, and then emerge, reborn as a divine king. The ceremony made explicit what the mythology taught: power over the land required relationship with the powers under the land. These anthropological accounts were more sympathetic than earlier colonial writings, but they still tended to treat Naga beliefs as cultural artifacts, objects of study, rather than as living religious realities. The scholars were outsiders, describing from a position of detached observation. They could catalogue rituals, photograph shrines, interview practitioners, but they could not, or would not, enter into the worldview that made those rituals and shrines necessary and meaningful. One of the most striking historical events involving Naga belief occurred during World War II in Burma. In late 1944, as British and Indian forces fought to retake Burma from Japanese occupation, there were reports from villagers in the Irrawaddy Delta of Nagas appearing in dreams to warn of coming danger, or of strange lights seen over lakes the night before battles. These accounts are fragmentary, preserved in regimental diaries, and in interviews conducted by the British historian Louis Allen for his 1984 book Burma, The Longest War. Allen treated the stories with skepticism but recorded them carefully, noting that both Allied and Japanese soldiers were aware of local Naga beliefs and that some officers consulted with village elders before crossing rivers or camping near lakes. Not because they believed in Nagas themselves, but because they understood that their troops, many of them Indian or Burmese, did, and that morale could be affected. In one documented incident from January 1945, a British unit preparing to cross the Chindwin River at night was warned by local villagers that the Naga of that stretch of river was particularly powerful, and that certain rituals should be performed before the crossing. The commanding officer, Captain Michael Calvert, permitted a Buddhist monk attached to the Burmese auxiliaries to conduct a brief ceremony on the riverbank. The crossing proceeded without incident. Calvert, in his memoir Prisoners of Hope, 1952, wrote that he saw no harm in the ceremony, and that it settled the nerves of the local troops. He did not speculate on whether the Naga was real, only that the belief in the Naga was real and had to be respected. This pragmatic approach, neither belief nor disbelief, but operational acknowledgement, was perhaps the closest the colonial and military encounter came to genuine engagement with Naga tradition. It recognized that the mythology was not just a story but a social technology, a way of navigating danger, of creating solidarity, of encoding environmental knowledge. In the decades following World War II and the independence of Asian nations from colonial rule, Western academic interest in Naga mythology shifted again. The rise of psychoanalytic and symbolic interpretations, influenced by Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, reframed the Naga as an archetype, the serpent as a universal symbol of transformation, the Kundalini energy coiled at the base of the spine in yogic anatomy, the dragon, serpent as a manifestation of the unconscious. These interpretations had some grounding in actual Hindu and Buddhist teachings about Kundalini, but they tended to universalize and decontextualize, extracting the Naga from its specific cultural and ecological settings. The most influential work in this vein was Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces 1949, which drew on Naga mythology as one example of the serpent, guardian motif found in cultures worldwide. Campbell's approach was syncretistic, seeing all myths as variations on a single underlying structure. This had the advantage of treating non-Western traditions with a kind of respect, seeing them as expressing truths as valid as those of Greek or Christian mythology. But it also flattened the particularities, the local meanings, the ways that Naga stories were tied to specific rivers, specific temples, specific lineages of kings and monks. By the late 20th century, as post-colonial critique became more prominent in academia, scholars from South and Southeast Asia began to write their own histories of Naga mythology, challenging both the colonial dismissals and the Western universalizing. Indian scholars like Moti Chandra, in his 1970 study, The World of Courtesans, examined Naga narratives not as primitive superstitions or psychological archetypes, but as sophisticated literary traditions encoding social, political, and environmental knowledge. Thai scholars like Nidhi Eosiwong wrote about the political uses of Naga imagery in Thai nationalism, the ways that the serpent's association with water and fertility made it a natural symbol for the agrarian state. These scholars emphasized that for millions of people in contemporary South and Southeast Asia, the Naga remains a living presence, not a relic. New Naga shrines are built, old ones are maintained, offerings are made, dreams are interpreted, illnesses are attributed to Naga displeasure and treated with rituals as well as medicine. This is not because these communities are backward or uneducated. Many Naga devotees are urban, literate, technologically sophisticated. It is because the worldview that includes Nagas is not incompatible with modernity. It is a different modernity, one that does not require the disenchantment of nature, the reduction of the world to purely material forces. The most thoroughly documented Naga-related event in modern history involves not a single incident, but an ongoing series of sightings and rituals centered on the Mekong River, which flows through China, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The Mekong is one of the great rivers of Asia, and throughout its length, it is associated with Naga mythology. In Lao and Thai tradition, the river is said to be the home of a particular Naga king, and numerous festivals along its banks celebrate this connection. The most famous of these is the Naga Fireball Festival, held annually in October at the end of Buddhist Lent, in the area around Nong Khai in northeastern Thailand. The phenomenon that gives the festival its name is remarkable, and despite various investigations, not fully explained. On certain nights during this period, glowing orbs rise from the surface of the Mekong River and ascend into the sky where they disappear. These fireballs are typically reddish or orange, varying in size from a golf ball to a basketball, and they appear in clusters, sometimes dozens in a single night. The first Western documentation of the phenomenon comes from the American journalist Richard Ehrlich, who investigated it in the late 1990s and published an article in the Bangkok Post in November 2000. Ehrlich interviewed local villagers, Buddhist monks, and Thai scientists who had attempted to study the lights. The villagers uniformly attributed the fireballs to the Naga. They were, in the traditional explanation, the Naga's breath, or flames from the Naga's celebration of the end of Buddhist Lent. Several monks told Ehrlich that the Naga king of the Mekong was paying homage to the Buddha, just as the Naga Mukkalinda had done millennia before. Thai scientists, led by a team from Nakhon Phanom University, conducted studies in 2002 and 2003, documented in the Thai language journal Warasan, Wichai Mahawidyalai, Nakhon Phanom University Research Journal. They deployed cameras, spectrometers, and water quality monitors. Some researchers hypothesized that the fireballs were pockets of methane gas released from the river bottom, igniting upon contact with air. But the methane hypothesis had problems. The fireballs appeared reliably at certain times of year and certain locations. Not randomly, they rose vertically, sometimes several hundred feet, rather than drifting with wind or water current. And no residue, no chemical trace, was ever found on the water surface after an emergence. In 2003, a documentary crew from the Thai television network, ITV, conducted an expose fay, claiming that the fireballs were a hoax, created by villagers firing tracer rounds from the Laotian side of the river to attract tourists. The documentary created a scandal. Local villagers and monks were outraged, insisting that while human-made fireworks were sometimes set off in addition to the natural phenomenon, the real Naga fireballs were not faked. The controversy was covered in The Nation, an English-language Thai newspaper. In December 2003, a follow-up investigation by the Thai government's Ministry of Science concluded that the original fireballs observed before the festival became commercialized in the 1990s were genuine unexplained phenomena, though the ministry could not determine their cause. The Naga Fireball Festival continues to this day, drawing tens of thousands of visitors each year. For believers, the scientific ambiguity is irrelevant. The Naga is not a physical object to be detected with instruments. The fireballs are a manifestation, a sign, a moment when the boundary between the seen and unseen worlds becomes thin. Another well-documented series of events occurred in South India, in the state of Kerala, during the devastating floods of August 2018. The Periyar River, one of the longest rivers in Kerala, overflowed its banks following unprecedented monsoon rains, displacing more than 1 million people and causing over 400 deaths. In the weeks following the flood, newspapers including the Times of India and the Hindu reported a surge in offerings at Naga shrines throughout the affected areas. Villagers, interviewed by journalists, explained that the floods were a warning from the Nagas, angered by deforestation, pollution, and the construction of dams that had disrupted the river's natural flow. In the town of Manarasala, home to one of the most important Naga temples in Kerala, the temple priestess, Valayamma Thampurati, gave an interview to the Indian Express on the 10th of September 2018. She stated that the Nagas had been neglected, that the old rituals were no longer being performed properly, and that the land had become out of balance. She called for a return to traditional water management practices, which in Kerala traditionally involved small-scale irrigation systems, maintained by local communities, with each community responsible for keeping a portion of land wild as a Naga grove. These groves served as buffer zones, flood absorption areas, and biodiversity reserves. When they were cleared for development, the ecological balance shifted. The Naga, in this interpretation, was not a superstition separate from hydrology, but a way of encoding hydrological and ecological knowledge. Environmental scientists, including Dr. Ravi Chopra, director of the People's Science Institute in Uttarakhand, India, later noted that the areas which had maintained traditional Naga groves experienced less severe flooding than areas where the groves had been cleared. His analysis, published in Current Science in January 2019, did not invoke the Naga as a spiritual being, but acknowledged that the traditional practices associated with Naga worship had sound ecological basis. This convergence of religious tradition and environmental science represents a contemporary framing of the Naga legend, one that neither dismisses it as superstition nor treats it as pure symbolism. The Naga becomes a conceptual tool, a way of thinking about the agency of natural systems, the consequences of environmental degradation, the necessity of maintaining wild spaces within human-dominated landscapes. A different kind of documentation comes from Bhutan, where the government conducts an annual survey of gross national happiness that includes questions about spiritual well-being and relationship with the natural environment. In the 2015 survey, published by the Center for Bhutan Studies and GNH Research, respondents from rural areas were asked about their beliefs regarding Lu, the Tibetan and Dzongkha term for Naga. Over 60% of respondents reported that they made regular offerings to Lu, and nearly 40% reported that they had experienced dreams or visions involving Lu at some point in their lives. These were not fringe beliefs. They were mainstream, held by farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, government workers. The Bhutanese government, in its environmental policies, has incorporated traditional Lu protection zones, areas around certain lakes, springs, and rivers, where development is prohibited and where traditional rituals are maintained. This is codified in the National Environment Protection Act of 2007, which explicitly references the need to protect sacred sites, including those associated with Lu. The policy is presented not in mystical terms, but in the language of biodiversity conservation and cultural heritage. Yet the underlying structure is the Naga tradition. Certain spaces are not human spaces, and they must be respected. Perhaps the most dramatic recent case involves the Nam Theon 2 Dam project in Laos, one of the largest hydroelectric dams in Southeast Asia, completed in 2010. During the construction phase, which began in 2005, workers reported numerous accidents, illnesses, and strange occurrences. According to an article in the Vientiane Times from March 2007, local shamans and Buddhist monks were brought in to perform rituals to appease the Nagas believed to inhabit the river and the surrounding forest. The article, written primarily as human interest rather than serious reportage, nonetheless included interviews with several workers who stated they would not continue working unless the rituals were performed. The Korean and Thai construction companies overseeing the project initially resisted, viewing the rituals as superstition and a waste of time. But after a series of accidents, including a crane collapse that killed 2 workers in February 2007, the companies relented. A large ceremony was held at the dam site in April 2007, led by Lao monks and attended by hundreds of workers. Offerings were made to the Nagas. Permission was formally asked for the alteration of the river, and compensation rituals were performed. After the ceremony, the accident rate decreased, and construction proceeded on schedule. The dam was completed and became operational without further major incidents. Western engineers and project managers interviewed later for a 2012 case study in the International Journal of Hydropower, and dams attributed the change to improved morale and focus among workers following the ritual. They did not entertain the possibility that the ritual had worked in any supernatural sense, but the Lao workers themselves, in follow-up interviews conducted by anthropologist Tuptim for her 2015 dissertation at the University of Washington, were clear. The ritual had addressed the Nagas. The Nagas had accepted the offering and the apology, and the work had been allowed to continue. For them, the explanation was simple and complete. These cases, the Mekong fireballs, the Kerala floods, the Bhutanese surveys, the Lao Dam rituals, represent the continued vitality of Naga belief in the 21st century. They are not isolated survivals in remote villages, but part of the lived experience of millions of people navigating the intersection of traditional worldviews and modern development, environmental crisis, and globalization. The Nagas' entry into global popular culture began in the mid-20th century, primarily through the spread of interest in Asian religions and martial arts in Western countries. The first significant appearance of Naga mythology in English language fiction came with the translations of Hindu and Buddhist texts by early Western scholars. But these were academic and had limited reach. It was not until the rise of fantasy literature in the 1960s and 1970s that the Naga began to appear as a character type. In 1966, the American author L. Sprague de Camp published The Goblin Tower, the first novel in his Noveria series. The book featured a race called the Nagas, directly borrowed from Hindu, Buddhist mythology, but adapted for a Western fantasy audience. De Camp's Nagas were serpentine, intelligent, dangerous, and capable of magic. But they were villains, antagonists aligned with dark sorcerers, lacking the moral complexity and divine status they held in their original traditions. This pattern, extracting the Naga's visual characteristics and supernatural abilities, while stripping away its spiritual and cultural context, would be repeated frequently in later fantasy literature and games. The most influential early use of the Naga in Western media was in Dungeons & Dragons, the tabletop role-playing game first published in 1974. The original D&D monster manual, released in 1977, included the Naga as a creature type, describing several varieties: Spirit Naga, Guardian Naga, Water Naga. The game's description drew loosely on Asian mythology, but adapted it to fit the game's mechanics and European fantasy aesthetics. The D&D Naga could shapeshift into human form, cast spells, and was often depicted as guarding treasure or ancient knowledge, elements drawn from authentic Naga lore. But the game also categorized Nagas by alignment, good, evil, or neutral, in a way that simplified the moral ambiguity of the original myths, and it placed them in dungeons and castles rather than rivers and temples. Dungeons and Dragons had an enormous influence on fantasy media globally. Its version of the Naga became the template for countless novels, video games, and films in the decades that followed. The Naga appeared in the Warcraft game series starting in 2002, in World of Warcraft 2004, where they were depicted as a fallen race of aquatic elves, cursed into serpent form by an ancient goddess. This version retained the serpent, human hybrid appearance, and the association with water, but entirely replaced the Hindu, Buddhist cosmological framework with a new European-style curse narrative. In the Elder Scrolls video game series, particularly in the Elder Scrolls Online 2014, a race called the Naga appears, again as a serpentine humanoid race, but here connected to Argonians, the lizard, people of the game's lore, rather than to any external mythological system. The name Naga is used more for its exotic resonance than for any cultural authenticity. One of the few Western fantasy works to engage more thoughtfully with Naga mythology is Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea series. While Le Guin does not use the term Naga directly, her dragons, intelligent, ancient, capable of speech and magic, intimately connected to elemental forces and to the true names of things, draw heavily on Asian dragon and Naga traditions rather than on European dragon myths. Le Guin, who studied Taoism and Buddhism and was deeply critical of Western colonialism, approached her mythological sources with more care than most fantasy authors. In The Farthest Shore, 1972, and Tehanu, 1990, the dragons are not mere monsters or treasures to be won, but beings with their own cultures, languages, and moral orders, demanding respect and negotiation. This is much closer to the spirit of the original Naga than the D&D approach. In South and Southeast Asian popular culture, the Naga has always remained central, but its representation has evolved. In Indian cinema, Nagas have appeared in numerous films, particularly in the Telugu, Tamil, and Malayalam language industries, which draw heavily on Hindu mythology. The 1976 Telugu film Naga Devatha, Serpent Goddess, depicted a Naga princess seeking revenge for the destruction of her sacred grove, a story that combined traditional mythology with social commentary on deforestation. The film was a commercial success and spawned a subgenre of Naga related films in South Indian cinema. The most financially successful and culturally significant Naga film is the 2012 Bollywood production Nagavali, though it is less centered on Naga mythology than on possession and revenge themes. More direct is the 1986 Tamil film Panagai Manan, which includes a subplot involving a Naga king and a human princess, drawing explicitly on the marriage myths from the Mahabharata. In Thai cinema, the Naga appears frequently, both as a mythological figure and as a symbol of national identity. The 2006 Thai film The Tsunami Warrior features Naga imagery prominently. The film uses the Naga as a symbol of the land's spiritual power and the hero's connection to it. Thai television dramas regularly incorporate Naga legends, especially in historical dramas set during the Ayutthaya or Sukhothai periods, where the Naga's role in royal legitimation is dramatized. In comic books and manga, the Naga appears in several forms. The Japanese manga series Naga Raja, 2009 to 2012, by Woo Soo-jung presents a more faithful adaptation of Hindu-Buddhist Naga mythology, with a protagonist who is a Naga prince in human form, navigating the complexities of human and serpent identity. The series was popular in South Korea and Japan, and was later translated into Thai, where it found an appreciative audience already familiar with the source material. The transformation of the Naga in Western popular culture generally follows a predictable pattern. The visual design is borrowed, the supernatural powers are retained or exaggerated, but the cosmological and spiritual context is discarded. The Naga becomes a monster type, a fantasy race, a video game enemy. This is not necessarily malicious. It is the nature of how myths travel across cultures, adapted and repurposed for new audiences. But something is lost. The Naga in Dungeons and Dragons does not carry the weight of thousands of years of ritual practice. The ecological knowledge encoded in taboos, the moral teaching about the relationship between human and non-human worlds. In recent years, there has been a modest but significant effort by South and Southeast Asian creators to reclaim and reframe their own mythologies for global audiences. The Indian author Amish Tripathi, in his Shiva trilogy, 2010 to 2013, and Ramchandra series, 2015 to 2019, incorporates Naga characters who are not villains, but complex figures with their own societies. Tripathi's Nagas are a marginalized people, outcasts due to genetic deformities, drawing a parallel to caste discrimination in contemporary India. This use of the Naga as a metaphor for social justice reinterprets the mythology for modern concerns, while maintaining its Hindu cultural context. The 2023 video game Raji, an ancient epic, developed by the Indian studio Nodding Heads Games, features Naga characters and imagery throughout, set in a world drawn from Hindu and Balinese mythology. The game presents the Nagas as allies to the protagonist, wise and powerful beings who aid in the fight against demons. This is closer to traditional depictions, showing the Naga as part of the divine order rather than as monstrous outsiders. These contemporary adaptations, whether in South Asian cinema, literature, or games, tend to preserve the moral complexity of the Naga, neither wholly good nor wholly evil, not human but not monstrous, demanding respect and reciprocity. They keep the Naga within its cultural and spiritual ecosystem. Western adaptations, by contrast, tend to extract the Naga from that ecosystem, making it a free-floating signifier of exoticism or danger. The evolution of Naga imagery in popular culture thus mirrors the broader history of how non-Western mythologies have been treated in the global imagination. Admired for their aesthetics, mined for their narrative potential, but often divorced from the worldviews that gave them meaning. The challenge for contemporary creators, both in Asia and in the West, is to find ways to honor the sources while still making the stories accessible and relevant to new audiences. This is not a matter of dogmatic fidelity to original forms. Myths have always changed, but of recognizing what is lost when the change is driven by ignorance or appropriation, rather than by informed adaptation. In the 21st century, the Naga has become a symbol not only of ancient mythology, but of the ongoing negotiation between tradition and modernity, between local knowledge and global culture, between human ambition and environmental limits. When the Nagas are angered in a Kerala flood story, they are standing in for the river system's carrying capacity, the forest's ability to absorb water, the consequences of treating nature as a resource to be exploited rather than a presence to be respected. When the Bhutanese government protects Lu zones, it is enacting a conservation policy that predates modern ecology by centuries, but that ecology now validates. The Naga teaches us that the world is full of agencies that are not human. Some of those agencies we now describe in the language of science: hydrological cycles, tectonic processes, ecosystem dynamics. Others we describe in the language of spirit: gods, ancestors, guardians. But the boundary between these languages is not as firm as modern Western thought assumed. The Naga is both. It is the pattern in the water and the being in the pattern. It is the system and the spirit of the system. This is what makes the Naga one of the most important mythical beings in Asian culture and potentially in global culture. It offers a way of thinking about non-human intelligence, about the rights and agencies of natural systems, that is neither purely materialist nor purely mystical. It is a model for relationship rather than domination. The human who honors the Naga does not control the river, but they may live beside it without catastrophe. The king who claims Naga ancestry acknowledges that his power comes from the land, not from his own virtue, and that he is accountable to forces older and deeper than any human institution. In a time of climate crisis, mass extinction, and ecological collapse, the Naga's lesson is urgent. The waters are rising. The old patterns are breaking. The beings we dismissed as superstition are manifesting as droughts and floods, as rivers choked with plastic, as oceans turning acidic. We have treated the world as if it were inert matter, resources to be extracted, terrain to be conquered. The Naga tradition says, the world is alive. It has memory. It responds. It can be honored or violated, but it cannot be ignored. The serpent guards the temple. The temple is the world. And if you look closely, if you approach with respect, with offerings, with a willingness to see, you will notice that the serpent's eyes are open. They have always been open. They have been watching, waiting, remembering. And when the waters rise, when the storms come, when the old contracts are broken, and the balance tips, the serpent will move. But in the ancient, impartial motion of a force that was here long before we arrived, and will remain long after we have gone. The question is not whether the Naga is real. The question is whether we are capable of living in a world where it might be, whether we can hold space for forms of intelligence, forms of agency, forms of sovereignty that are not human, whether we can see the temple for what it is, not a building, but a threshold, not a place we own, but a place we are permitted to enter. If we enter with humility, the serpent guards the temple, and it has human eyes. But perhaps the reverse is also true. Perhaps we have serpent eyes. Some of us, some of the time. Perhaps the boundary was never as clear as we thought. Perhaps when we poison the water, we poison our own blood. Perhaps when we honor the Naga, we honor something in ourselves that knows how to live in reciprocity with the world. Something that has been forgotten in the noise of progress and empire, but never entirely lost. The Naga endures in stone carvings and temple murals, in offerings left at the water's edge, in the dreams of farmers and the visions of monks, in the policies of governments and the stories of grandmothers, in the fireballs rising from the Mekong River on October nights, witnessed by thousands, unexplained by science, undeniable in their presence. The Naga endures because it is necessary. It is the name we give to the covenant between human and earth, to the knowledge that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that the land is full of eyes and intelligence and memory. And when the temple doors open, when the rains come or fail to come, when the rivers flood or run dry, when the earth shakes or holds steady, the serpent will be there, coiled and patient, watching with those human eyes, asking the only question that matters: did you remember? Did you offer what was owed? Did you live as if the world were sacred, or as if it were yours to destroy? The answer will determine whether the serpent remains a guardian or becomes, once again, what it has always been capable of being: an agent of transformation, swift and absolute, returning everything to the waters from which it came. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.